Welcome to Sizzle Fantasy Sports, the channel with the most sizzling hot fantasy takes and analysis, presented by your host, Gavin.
Rodgers clean pocket, throws the middle of the end zone, Devontae, touchdown, and a dagger!
What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I have some early running back rankings for you guys for the 2021 NFL season. It's a little bit too far out to put exact numbers on these guys just yet, but I have them broken up into some tiers based off of how I expect guys to either come back this season or project them going forward. So we're going to start getting back into some fantasy content here. I've been doing a lot of NFL-based stuff and franchise-type things like mock drafts and whatnot. We're going to keep doing that, but we're looking to add some more fantasy content into the mix. So I've got 10 or 11 guys here that I think are very prime prospects to be RB1s next season. So without further ado, if you guys are new around here, make sure to click that subscribe button and like this video, and we'll see you guys with the first player. All right, my first guy up on the board here is Christian McCaffrey. He's kind of capping off the start of my tier of those 1A running backs, those RB1s that regardless of your format, your fantasy scoring settings, you're picking these guys in the top three. McCaffrey was the consensus first overall pick for the most part last season. I think that there's maybe a couple other names that should be in that territory this year, especially after the time McCaffrey missed. But frankly, I'm not too concerned whatsoever, and I don't think you guys should be either about him only playing 3 games last year. I know he kept getting dinged up, but he's had a lot of time to rest. It's a long offseason, and for a guy who, like I said, only played 3 games, I think that he will have sufficient time to recover. And he averaged just a tick over 25 touches per game last season. Volume is key when we're talking about fantasy football running backs, and Christian McCaffrey did it at an elite level. And on top of that, he was producing touchdowns as well. He had 6 TDs in those 3 games played, and the Panthers' offense really just revolves around what CMC is able to do for them. So I think having McCaffrey back next season, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be, but clearly it doesn't really matter. I think he's going to be that elite top 3 running back player regardless of who's out there. If it's Teddy B, we know he can get it done because of what we saw even in that limited sample size last year. And if they upgrade to a Deshaun Watson, he could potentially get even better, or maybe they go to the draft and pick a young quarterback there. So there's a lot of opportunity for McCaffrey here. He is going to see those crazy touches that we saw him get in 2019. I expect a touchdown ceiling to still be there. And I think from a scrimmage yard standpoint, for a guy who can catch the ball as elite as McCaffrey can, you've got yourself the whole package here with CMC. The other guy I see in that top class of running backs along with McCaffrey, this is actually my only other guy I'm going to put in that category, is Dalvin Cook, the RB3 finisher from 2020. I don't think it's too big of a deal to look back at how they finished in 2020 because of how injuries played out and whatnot. And you'll see some guys on this list missed significant time, so they fell way down the RB rankings boards. But Dalvin Cook is another guy who the offense is completely centered around him in Minnesota. Obviously, they have a very competent passing game. Justin Jefferson is very, very good and showed really elite route running skills and just potential in his rookie season. Adam Thielen is a seasoned veteran who clearly has a body of work that shows he can get the job done. And Kirk Cousins, I don't care what you say, you can fight me on this one. Kirk Cousins is a top 12 quarterback. This is a very good offense. They run block quite well. They're not so hot on the pass blocking side of things, but a very complete offense, and Dalvin Cook is the centerpiece of what they're trying to do in Minnesota. I think that Cook is one of, if not the best running back in the game right now. He is also just over 25 touches per game. The volume, like I said with McCaffrey, is everything for these top tier running backs. They get more touches than anyone else does in fantasy football. And for these guys, as many cracks as you can have at it in a game, that's going to matter a ton. Dalvin Cook also had over 1,900 yards from scrimmage, and he had 356 total touches on the season. So lots of opportunity for Cook here. I expect him fully to come back strong in 2021, and I think once again, this is a guy who is going to be an elite running back, and I would even consider with that first overall pick, if you are not really sure who to go with, I think that he is definitely a fair option at 1. Then in that second tier of running backs here, I know what you guys are probably thinking. A certain name, I'll just point it out right now, Alvin Kamara did not make that top tier list of running backs. I'll get into that in a second here, but Derrick Henry, by the way, you guys, this is in no particular order. Like I said, I'm breaking this up into tiers. I think that right now we can just kind of group running backs with how we expect them to perform and players with similar potential and safe floors as the guys around them. So obviously, I think all these guys in this list have the upright potential to be RB1s in fantasy next season, but RB1s are not created equal. There are those elite guys who stand out from the rest of the pack, and there's guys who are fringe RB1s that barely hang on to that position. So Derrick Henry here is in my second tier of RB1s. Henry is a standard league stud, let's be honest here. He rushed for 2,000 yards in 2020. And if there was a running back in the NFL whose entire offense was built around him, it is Derrick Henry. As much as Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook are the centerpieces of their offense, Tennessee, really, their identity is Derrick Henry. He had nearly 400 touches, which is a substantial amount higher than any other running back on this list. I know we talk about it every year with this guy, the durability concerns and how many hits can Derrick Henry take, but this is a physically imposing player. And maybe the most impressive thing that I saw on this list was how many explosive plays Henry had in 2020. He was able to have 16 of those. And an explosive play is defined as a play 20 or more yards. So on the ground, Derrick Henry had 16 times where he ran for 20 plus yards. That is far and away higher than everyone on this list. 16 is a super high number for a running back. I think we'll get into the guy who came in second, who I was also very impressed with later on in this list. But Henry is a guy who has touchdown volume. He is going to have far and away more touches than anyone else in fantasy will if he stays healthy. We haven't seen injury concerns out of him to this point in his career, although who knows how fast those hits and that durability can catch up to him. But Henry here, he's super safe. He's very consistent. And I think playing in that AFC South is a really great sign for him to come back and once again be a top 3, top 5 running back in fantasy. At the next spot here, I've got Alvin Kamara, the RB1 finisher from 2020, And just for a frame of reference here, I forgot to mention this earlier. The running back rankings you can see on the screen, those are in half PPR scoring. So like I said, though, it's not a huge deal how they finished in 2020 because of injuries and whatnot, and how I project things to be changing and evolving as we move throughout this offseason. So Kamara takes a slight hit for me. I really hate to move him back here, to be honest. I think that he's probably the most versatile offensive weapon in the NFL right now. But just the question marks we have around the Saints. We don't know who is going to be playing quarterback for that offense. I think that Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill are the two likely candidates. But regardless, I think if you have Jameis, you're going to be airing out the ball a bit more. I think Taysom Hill wants to have some quarterback ground game in that offense, and that's what we saw Sean Payton use him with. So, and when Breeze was hurt last season, the amount of receiving volume that Kamara had, and honestly his total touches came down significantly. And for a guy who only had 16.9 touches per game, every touch counts for Kamara. He's extremely efficient, obviously, being the RB1 with nearly 8 less touches per game than the first two guys on this list. But there is some reason for concern. Another thing being the touchdown volume is certain to decrease. In 2019, I think just about every fantasy analyst, had him projected for an uptick because of how small his numbers were that season. And he completely boomed through the roof. He had 21 total touchdowns this past season, 16 on the ground and 5 through the air. He had 6 in one game. That's going to come down. That's not going to happen again next season. And when you're getting 6 points out of every one of those scores, that inflates your numbers a ton. And that's not to say that Alvin Kamara is not an elite fantasy running back. I think he's that tier 1B running back with Derrick Henry and a guy who can be super productive, but not necessarily worth a first overall pick, as I think some people might generally assume at this point. Another guy I've got in the same tier with him is Nick Chubb, the Cleveland Browns lead back. Nick Chubb, when I dove into the stats and the details, was one of the guys who really, really impressed me. I knocked on him a ton last offseason and kind of compared him to Josh Jacobs in that they don't really catch passes. But where Nick Chubb differentiates himself from a lot of running backs and provides crazy value in fantasy is right behind Derrick Henry. This guy has far and away more explosive rushes than anyone else in the NFL. His explosive play on the ground makes up for the lack of receptions and air yards that he puts up in fantasy because he had 12 explosive rushes in just 12 games. So he's having, on average, a rush of 20 or more yards once every game, and that's something we don't see here. I think Dalvin Cook had about 6, I believe, this past season, and some other guys in this list didn't even crack double digits either. So the fact that he was able to do that while missing 4 games is highly impressive to me. And Nick Chubb is a guy who has more touches per game than a guy like Alvin Kamara. So the volume is still there for Chubb despite having Kareem Hunt in the backfield. I think going into next season, Chubb is certainly a guy you take as a top 5 running back in all leagues. Maybe he cracks the top 6 in PPR, for full PPR rather. So nonetheless, I'm taking Nick Chubb early in fantasy drafts next season, barring change. Jonathan Taylor here is also in that class, I think, with Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry, and Alvin Kamara. Jonathan Taylor, he has a top 3 offensive line. And what we saw from JT at the end of last season was one of the more impressive finishes we saw by a running back last year. David Montgomery finished the season on fire. Cam Akers was looking pretty good before he got dinged up. JT, I think, is in for a huge year 2 explosion. He's a young running back. He has a top 3 O-line in the NFL. I think the one thing that could really be polarizing for JT is the Carson Wentz deal. I think some people you're going to have saying that Carson Wentz is going to demolish his value because I understand where the Carson Wentz hate comes from. He threw tons of interceptions with the Eagles, and the turnovers really killed Miles Sanders' run game when he was primed for a big breakout season. But I can also see the other side, which is where I tend to align with, is that Wentz increases the ceiling in that offense. Carson Wentz played his best football under Frank Reich, their head coach, and I think that he just gives that offense a better chance to produce elite numbers. Jonathan Taylor is probably one of the most pure running backs in the league behind Nick Chubb, and I just love how he plays the game. He had 7 explosive carries in 2020. And I think going forward, if he's able to find the open field more, I mean, like I said, he did not get things going until the back quarter of last season. So I think if he were able to find his stride and his rhythm prior to that, that number would be much higher right now. So JT is a guy I love going into next year. I think another underrated part of his game is his value as a pass catcher. JT is another guy who is definitely a top 6 fantasy running back for 2021. And then the last guy rounding out this second tier here is Saquon Barkley for the New York Giants. Obviously, Barkley played, 1.5 games last season. He suited up for 2, tore his ACL early on last season. So clearly he didn't have the amount of games or the sample size to put up a relevant fantasy season. But Barkley, when he's fully healthy, is on another level from a talent standpoint than anyone else on this list. I went back and watched some 2018 Saquon Barkley highlights, and this guy is just not human. He is so athletic, and he is so crazy explosive and fast in the open field. And the moves you see this guy pull off are just ridiculous. But there's that huge looming question, and obviously that big stigma around picking Barkley early in the top 2 or 3 picks like we've seen him go every year of his career, is that ACL. How is he going to recover? How is he going to perform back? And I think that certainly limits and kind of gives us a huge question and hesitation when picking Barkley early on in the first round. I think he's a bit more of a mid to late first round pick. I think somewhere between the 1.8 and 110 would be a reasonable spot to take Barkley. I just don't know if I want to gamble and put all my chips into the middle of the table for a guy who's coming off such a significant injury. Saquon could absolutely finish as a top tier guy and be in that top group along with McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook if he hits his ceiling and puts up the numbers that he could. But I think it's reasonable to pull back our expectations a bit this season and play things out a little bit and see what happens, because if you took your risk on him last season, your season probably didn't end out so hot because of how obviously that injury and things played out for him. I do have hope with the Giants because of how productive Wayne Gallman and Devontae Freeman were able to be in terms of that offensive line blocking. So hopefully things continue to be upgraded even more this offseason, and Saquon Barkley could be in for a very, very productive year. Into this third tier of RB1s I've got here, these are guys that start to have some real concerns about them. They've been very productive in the past, or I'm even projecting them to be extremely productive in the future, but they're not exactly players that are shoo-ins to be those these top-end RB1s that you hope they would be. The first guy is Aaron Jones. Obviously, Aaron Jones has played his entire career as a Green Bay Packer, but he's currently a free agent, finished as RB6 in half PPR last season. Jones is another one of those very explosive running backs. He's very efficient. He only had 17.7 touches per game last season. He played in a bit of a committee and was still able to find great success in fantasy and still be a very relevant back despite losing complete series out to Jamal Williams and A.J. Dillon. So Jones, I wouldn't be particularly surprised if he is not in the green and gold next season. I think that there's a real chance with the cap struggles this year and the cap coming down due to COVID that he ends up in a new uniform. And my pick that I kind of have in mind for him to land at is the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, Myles Gaskin was a very solid guy as an undrafted player last year, and he produced nicely, but I think Aaron Jones is a big upgrade. He fits the team well. I think he can help Tua out. A little bit of speculation here, and obviously anything can happen, but I don't expect him to be back with the Packers. Nonetheless, I'm not really concerned about where Aaron Jones lands unless it is in a very heavy committee-style offense because of how he was able to still produce in Green Bay while not being an absolute workhorse, getting 90% of the touches. I think that bids well for Jones in 2021. Next up here, I've got DAndre Swift for the Detroit Lions. I think Swift is a guy who, coming off of his rookie season, I saw a lot of things that I really, really liked out of his game. I think Swift could be potentially a top 5 running back in fantasy next season if he is able to fully maximize on his potential and really carry out the wishes of Dan Campbell's offense. He's talked about how he wants to pound the football, and one of his coaches even talked about how Swift is a 25 touch per game player. So clearly they really love what they see in DAndre Swift. They want to feed him the football. And quite honestly, he could be their best offensive player next season if Galladay ends up walking. I think they'll tag him or re-sign him, though. And depending on how quickly Swift develops, he might even bunny hop a guy like TJ Hawkinson in terms of talent. But that's a completely different situation and position. Obviously, Swift is far more valuable in fantasy. So DAndre Swift here, I think what he does as a receiver and what he's able to do in the open field makes him an extremely lucrative fantasy asset and a guy who can return some great points for your teams. I love this guy in any sort of PPR format, and I wouldn't be too shy about picking him at the end of the first round or top of the second in standard leagues either. So Swift, I have big expectations for him next season, and I think that he can deliver and reach those goals that we have set for him. Ezekiel Elliott is a guy who I have up next here that I would prefer not be on this list, but I think Zeke is a guy who time and time again has shown us that he deserves to at least still be considered as a fringe RB1 for next season. Zeke is a guy, he's getting, the touches are racking up. We saw him start to show a little bit of signs of being worn down last season, and Tony Pollard took over and showed that he is very explosive in that backfield, but Zeke, prior to that Dak Prescott injury, was still very, very relevant in fantasy. He kind of opened up a new asset of his game that we had not seen to this point in his career, and that is adding value as a pass-catching receiver in that backfield. He was catching a lot of balls out of the backfield from Dak, and he was showing that he can get work done in the open field, being something other than a rusher. So Zeke shows me a little bit of dynamic ability here. I think with Dak coming back and some actual competent quarterback play, he can start to get back into that RB8 through RB12 range. He ended up finishing as RB9, as you see on the screen there. So the strong start he had to last season did not really taper off too badly towards the back end of the year. His numbers were just very, very deflated at the end of the season with all of those line injuries and whatnot. So maybe even revamping some draft picks into that O-line could really help Zeke out this coming season. And I think he's a guy that I wouldn't be too close-minded to, but this is certainly not my favorite pick in the first round next year. I would probably fade him off my board for that. And then last up here, we've got Cam Akers of the Los Angeles Rams. This is another guy who I'm projecting to have a big breakout season in 2021. I think Akers has some of the best raw talent out of anybody in that 2020 draft class. I compare him to Dalvin Cook, another Florida State running back, who is just a guy who, when he gets the edge, he is gone. Cam Akers has some real burst. He has some real explosion. And I think in a Sean McVay offense that is very balanced, very, very efficient and productive offensively, Akers can really thrive. And I think a smart move with Akers might be, if you're going to invest early draft capital into him, maybe go out there and get a Darrell Henderson as a handcuff, because he did also show signs of getting dinged up a bit last season. So I would be careful with Cam Akers, but I would definitely project him to have monster numbers when he's on the field. That division is tough, but that doesn't shy me away from him at all. I really like him, and I think next year he definitely has some big things ahead. Those are some early running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy season. Before I get out of here, I want to toss in one more name before I head out. Joe Mixon is another guy to look at as a potential top 12 running back finisher next season. Mixon had 23.5 touches per game prior to being injured and missing the rest of the season last year, and he was a very, very productive player. Like I talked about throughout this video, volume is the name of the game in fantasy football for running backs, and Joe Mixon is certainly a guy who excelled at that. So without further ado, you guys, that will conclude today's video. Thank you so much for stopping by on the channel and taking time out of your day to watch some of my content. I really appreciate all of you guys, and if you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Peace out.